When approached by the organizers to participate in tonight's gathering, I hesitated, and I hesitated for a number of reasons. First of all, the format is by necessity performative and quite scripted. And in my life, perhaps to my own detriment sometimes, I'm not scripted. I also hesitated because I've been feeling a growing sense of grief around work with refugee communities and the necessity, as is oftentimes told to us, of the need to humanize women, men, and children who are making such perilous journeys. And finally, I hesitated because having worked with refugee, migrant, asylum seeker, and undocumented communities who so passionately and eloquently can represent their own stories and whose sense of self-agency and self-empowerment has been so deeply humbling to many of us who have worked with them, I felt like a bit of a hypocrite speaking for or on behalf of. However, some of the stories, some of the glimpses or the vignettes or the narratives that I'll be talking about tonight are those of people who are stuck in limbo, and because of their undocumented status, because of securitized and militarized borders, because of states of limbo, they cannot travel to be here. And what I can speak about is witness and accompaniment. I have been one of the many tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people who have tried in humble and small but coherent ways to respond to what is known as the refugee crisis over the past years. And that work has brought me to Greece, to camps in Calais and in Dunkirk, in the Balkans, in Lebanon. And it has been a process, I think, in which all of us who have participated in this attempt at showing solidarity and welcome in the face of policies that exclude and other and are so overtly racist. But it has been a process of learning. It has been a journey for many of us. And that's what I want to focus on tonight, I think more than anything, on, as how Arundhati Roy so eloquently puts it, but the tenacity of fragile beings. And if anything, I think that I've seen over the past years that has stayed with me, it's really been the resilience within vulnerability. And so often they are presented to us as very distinct subjective states. But I think my witness and that of so many other people has been in the fact that it is no contradiction for people to be so deeply courageous and so strong and so resilient and so painfully vulnerable at the same time. The work of trying to express or embody solidarity has been done, I think, on a community basis, in many different contexts in Europe. But its translation, though heartfelt, though empathetic, though sustained, has been in a way to enable us as a community to take our eyes off the policies that continue to define and quite deeply devastate the lives of those that we're trying to accompany and walk with. And it's been a source of critique and self-reflection for many of us within our movements, that as we focus on trying to provide dry clothes and shelter and hot meals and hospitality and welcome for those making the journey, the policies that exclude, that have externalized Europe's borders into the sea, that have direct causality with the deaths of tens of thousands of women, men, and children making these journeys continue and solidify. And that's been seen very, very overtly in the past weeks in terms of the focus, the coverage on the extreme sustained violence that those seeking refuge are subjected to in Libya. But that has been something that so many of those who have been engaged in search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean and in the Aegean have been pointing to for months, if not years. I have some photos that provide a backdrop for some of what I'm going to talk about. But I'd like to actually go into the stories of a few people that we've met. The first that I'm going to start with, and I wish I could do this more visually. I mean, in terms of video, one of the projects that I do with a compañero who's in the audience, Marcelo Biglia, is produce short video vignettes. And the purpose of these is to try and provide platform in a non-stylistic, non-over-narrated way of the voices of those seeking refuge. And it's been something that I've grappled with personally myself, because when you enter into any space of vulnerability or precarity with a camera, there is such a potential to overexpose people, in their moments of struggle. And it's something that I'm very cognizant of, in the sense that when you see rubber dinghies, landing on the shores of Greek islands, and so many cameras there, recording that vulnerability, that will be an archive, to those women, to those men, to those children, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now. And is it how they want their lives, and their journeys to be archived? I'd imagine not. So by bringing a camera into these spaces, into camps, we really tried to embody an ethic of accountability, and an ethic of care, one that was really based on understanding, that's so often this impetus, whether it's by governments or sometimes very well-intentioned NGOs, but to speak on behalf of people is so fundamentally disempowering to those seeking refuge. But some of those that we met over the course of our journeys with medical teams, their stories were profound and their courage was profound. And it made me think and sort of reframe in my own mind what a camera could be, that it could be an emancipatory tool, for framing these journeys rather than one that would diminish them in any way. But these two lovely young men who are in this photo are Mohammed Ismail and Hamdan, and they're two survivors of genocide in South Sudan. They're from Darfur, and they made a lot of their journey through Africa, through Libya, on foot. And while doing so, they were subjected to horrific violence. They were witness to horrific gender-based violence and rape of a lot of the women who accompanied them. And we met them in Calais. And it was a few days before the demolition of the camp happened. And we were standing on this little knoll at night. And I was trying to interact with Hamdan primarily because he's hearing impaired, he's deaf, and he signs. But he signs in a way that he taught himself. So it's very graphic, it's very descriptive, and it's very understandable. And I was trying to understand his story. And Mohammed, who is a friend of his, walked up to us. And Mohammed has a niece in Darfur who was deaf, so he knew some signing. And between my Arabic and Mohammed's signing and Hamdan's gesticulations, we began to understand his story. And so Hamdan told us his story of being in Libya, of being tortured, of being forced to work as an indentured laborer, and finally of his passage. And then Mohammed opened up with his story. And Mohammed was on a ship, a small boat that was crossing the Mediterranean, with people that he'd befriended along the journey and who became like brothers. And one of them was a young man named Ashraf. And Mohammed described as the boat, was traversing through the Mediterranean, just feeling the insignificance of his being reflected against just the vast skies and sea around him. And the boat started to sink. It went into distress, and Mohammed talked about, realizing that they were going to die, and the memories, both painful and beautiful in his life, flashing literally before his eyes. And as they began to sink, Ashraf, who he had gotten very close to, was aware of the fact that Mohammed could not swim, and he gave him his life jacket. And Ashraf ended up drowning, and Mohammed lived. And he talked about, just the fact that when he dreams at night, he remembers those moments so vividly, and the survivor's guilt that he walks with was devastating, even to witness it for those few hours. But Mohammed and Hamdan were one of almost 10,000 people who occupied a space in Calais that became a community. And for all of the humiliation, because it was profoundly humiliating for people in the camp, for all of the precarity and the violence that was visited upon those communities. There were also spaces of beauty and joy and resistance, very creative, life-giving, joy-asserting resistance within that camp. And that resistance existed in the form of social solidarity, of empathy, of compassion, and it was something really profound to witness. But they ended up being scattered, as many of the thousands of people in the camp were, in the aftermath of the demolition, and they both continue to live in very precarious conditions in France as they try to continue their journey. This is another Mohammed, the father of Ella. We met him in Basilica with his family. He's a deep feminist. He's the father of 5 daughters. And we sat with him in his tent, myself and Marcelo, as he reflected upon what humanity meant to him. And what was so clear was just the erosion of his dignity. And it was something that was painful to witness. It was painful for him to express. But it was something, I think, that both of us carried with us for a long time. Because he really framed humanity in the sense of what he felt his identity had been reduced down to. He was referred to as a number when he'd have to go and collect the rations of food for his family because he didn't want his wife and daughters to go through the humiliation of lining up. When the attendance in terms of that militarized camp and space was called, he would be identified as a number, and he lost his name for those months in the camp. And it was something, that he was saying in terms of his own mental health, that he had to try very, very hard to stay afloat with. This sense of negation of identity and this reduction, this diminishment of a father and of a man who was extremely brave, who had tried to keep his family safe, and who really, and this came across very clearly, was sacrificing so much in the hopes that his daughters would be able to fulfill their potential as the strong, empowered young woman that they were and are. This is Samar and Rania. There are 2 teachers from Aleppo that we met at the Idomeni crossing, and we met them in a period of flux. It was after the EU-Turkey deal when borders were solidifying or closing, and they were trying to cross. And again, they spoke with such dignity around what they missed about Syria, and a lot of what they missed about Syria, aside from their families, was social solidarity. It was family, and it was a sense of being, a very clearly, deeply rooted sense of identity. And if anything, that has been, I think, one of the most destructive things about this journey. It is so difficult for people to make meaning when all of the clear markers of their identity have been so violently dislodged. And it is something, I think, in any work in terms of trying to accompany refugee, migrant, asylum seeker, or undocumented communities that has to be very deeply understood, that need for meaning-making around these profoundly traumatic experiences. And this is Rana. Rana is a young Kurdish activist and mother that we met in Greece. And when we met her, she was 8 months pregnant. But we interviewed her, and she didn't refer to her daughter until the end. And she talked about her strength and her resilience, the resilience of Kurdish women, their fight for gender equality. And at the end, I asked her what she wanted to see in the future of her daughter's life. And she said, I want her to see beauty, and I don't want her to have to witness what I've witnessed. And Rana, up until 3 days ago, was still in a state of limbo. It took her 2 years to be able to rejoin the rest of her family in Germany. And that is the state of extended limbo that so many people are in, waiting for processes of family reunification or relocation. And it is profoundly disempowering as the experiences of living through the limbo of direct provision in Ireland, as profoundly disempowering as those who are forced to make such perilous journeys where if there were safe and legal means of safe passage, they could reunite with their families without having to go through the humiliation of these journeys. I think before I leave you, one story, I was sitting backstage, and as you may have noticed, I didn't script this purposely because I knew that I'd forget it, so I decided just to try and remember stories. But the story that I was thinking of backstage was of a little girl that I met on the Greek island of Lesbos. and she had been on a rubber dinghy with her family. She was from Caoimhe in Syria, and they were making the crossing in the winter. It was getting cold, and their boat began to sink. So the Coast Guard intervened, and they were transferred to their boat. And we were with a volunteer group who got the call to try and go and receive families, to be able to offer them at least dry clothes, and for the medics to try and respond to the hypothermia that some of them had by the time they came in shore. But Sara was this little 7-year-old girl. And I was chatting to her mother and her sisters, trying to normalize this completely abnormal situation for them of fear and apprehension and anxiety as they stepped on to another step in their very long journey to hope for refuge. But we were chatting, and they got changed, and then MSF came and took them towards a van, and Sara, as she was walking away, turned and ran back to me, and she pulled me down, and she just enveloped me in the biggest hug. And it was the most profound moment, I think, that I've had over the past few years, in the sense of just feeling this beautiful, beautiful, potential-laden little girl's heart just hammering away. And she was still shaking from the cold. And I remember just her little grip around me, and she wouldn't let go. And I looked up and was just blinded by this light and the sun. And finally, her mother came over, and because the van was waiting, and sort of extricated her little self. But Sara is one of so many little girls, so many little boys, so many women, so many men who are trying so hard to rebuild normalcy in their lives, trying so hard, to reclaim dignity and a sense of meaning and purpose and potential. And if my call to action tonight could be anything, it would be to embody solidarity that is not only predicated on empathy and pain and grief at the suffering that we are witnessing in these times, but a solidarity that is based also on justice, on the emancipatory potential, of really just trying to witness, I think, an alternative to so much that we have seen by our policymakers over the past few years. And there is so much potential to do that in small and humble ways, in bigger ways. And it does have impact. And if its only impact, is that one moment of human connection, that one moment of being seen, in your entirety of your lived history, of your potential, of your strength, of your beauty, of your passion, of your intelligence, it's worth it. So anything, I think, that people can do to engage with newly arrived communities here, with those navigating the limbo of direct provision, with those who have yet to set off on their perilous journeys, is so important. Because although it has become a cliche, I think really if we fail to act, at this stage, we become complicit in these needless deaths. And there are so many, and there will be so many more. And this is really the time to act. Thank you.